Amen. So I just want to recap what we've been learning so far. We know that there's a present truth message for each generation. We've understood that. We've seen what the present truth message of the history of Christ was, of Moses, and we're exploring what the present truth message for the Millerites were. Ellen White speaks about two things in 2T 693 paragraph 1 and 2. She speaks about the special truth, the present truth, the light, but she also speaks about this generation. So when we talk about this generation, we've gone to Matthew chapter 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and in verse 34 of Matthew 24 it talks about this generation. And we're trying to tie in this generation with the generation that's been mentioned here in 2T. So I want to take some of this material off. If we're okay with this line of Christ, they're expecting a deliverer who's going to deliver them from the Romans, but it actually works out that he's delivering them from sin. And before that, there needs to be this preparation, which we call repentance, the work of John the Baptist. In the line of Moses, they're expecting a deliverer to take them out of Egypt, and there's this preparatory work that needs to be done as well. And that preparatory work is, in that line, Sabbath observance. We saw that the testing isn't just at the empowerment of the first angel, it's actually all the way through. We can see it clearly marked at the time of the end. Then we went to the line of the Millerites, and we saw there that often we mark the end of the line in 1844, but that line actually extends further than that. It's not the end of their line, and that's what can throw you to think that in the 2T passage, when it says this generation, she writes this in 1871, that the special testing truth for the generation is the Sabbath, which is pretty clear, and the Sabbath becomes a test in October 1844. That's why we're marking here the Sabbath, because it's the arrival of the third angel. So we can see all of that, but then it's easy to assume that the generation begins at the same point as well. So we went to Matthew 24, and it talks about this generation, and what we want to understand is how do we apply the generation that's marked in Matthew 24 verse 34. And we spent some time doing that. So we looked at the chapter, and we saw it's in three sections: the history of the disciples, the history of the Dark Ages, and the history of the end of the world. When Christ discusses this passage, let's refresh our minds. Let's go to Matthew 24. In verse 3, and he sat upon the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us when these things shall be, what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world. So you see there are three questions there, but if you go to Mark and Luke, there's an additional question. What's that additional question in Mark and Luke that isn't here in Matthew? The signs of what?
Sign of destruction of Jerusalem.
So the sign of the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's the bit that's missing here. So we see that there's four questions, but we can condense them into two questions: the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the end of the world, or the destruction of the world. And so we've got the signs and the destruction, the signs and the destruction. So we've seen that, and they think that everything's going to happen at the same time. Why do they think that? My brother? Are you new? So maybe you haven't, Brother Andrew. Why do they think it's all going to happen at the same time?
Because previously Jesus told them that your house has been left until your darkness.
Okay, but that doesn't explain why they think the destruction of Jerusalem equals the end of the world. Why do they think that?
Yeah, to me is because Christ actually told them that he was going to come again, and then Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. So they thought that his second coming is also the destruction of the world or the end of the world.
Okay, so they're okay that his second coming is going to be the end of the world, but why are they tied in the destruction of Jerusalem with that same event? Am I brother?
Okay, they thought there was not any other movement to come after the Jewish church, and so they thought with the end of the Jewish church, that is the destruction of Jerusalem, then it would also bring the end of the world.
The way Jesus presented it, he mingled it. He didn't separate the destruction of Jerusalem alone, and also the destruction of the end of the world. He just mingled it.
So that wasn't my question. I know what Jesus does. My question is, why did the disciples ask it that way? Not why Jesus responds in the way he does. That would be a follow-on question. So the question is, why did the disciples think that way? Yep.
Okay. Because they thought Christ was going to come back in their generation.
But they don't know when the destruction of Jerusalem is going to be. He hasn't given them any indication.
Yeah, and Christ blended all those things together, those two events.
So again, you're talking about what Christ does. I want to know what the disciples are doing, not what Christ is doing.
They are these two events together because Christ has given them, or Christ has talked about them prior to this point about the destruction of Jerusalem, and they were not thinking that if Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, then Christ should be coming, and they are the only subject that are going to be okay, they are the only people that Christ is going to take them.
They're the only people that
Christ is going to save them, can put it that way.
When you say they're the only people, who is the they?
The disciples, not the Jew, not the Jewish nation, which are going to be destroyed at the end.
Okay.
I would argue that the Jews, the disciples thought that as the Jews they were the last generation, and so if destruction was to come, then they could even expect Christ to come and take them home.
So they think they're the final generation.
So I would agree with those people that are saying that it's the final generation, because the idea that disciples were having, they were having that the only God people, and if Christ is going to come or if the temple is going to be destroyed, that is the end of the world. So the only thing that they were thinking is that they're going to be taken to heaven.
Brother Wilson?
According to what we see yesterday, according to the disciples, the temple of Jerusalem was to be glorious to all nations. And the disciples, they understood that they were God's people in that generation. So that means if the Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, then there's not going to be another church, because they thought that they are the one who are what? They are God's people. So I will agree to what Martha said and the rest. And he thought they were the final church, the Jewish church, and they were the God's people in that generation. So if God is going to destroy Jerusalem, then he's going to mark the end, and Christ will come, the end of the world.
And also to add, the disciples also were absorbed in the temporal kingdom that Christ was coming to, according to how they understood it. That Christ was to set up a kingdom and to release them from the Roman yoke. So they appropriated the prophecies that were pointing to the second coming of Christ as to the time that Christ is to set up this kingdom and release them from the Roman yoke. So as we were reading yesterday, we read, I think it's all these salvages of great controversy, but I have a quote from great controversy, where she points out that they connected the scenes of the destruction of Jerusalem with the second coming of Christ, because in that they hope that Christ will set up a temporal kingdom. He will set up a temporal kingdom and release them from the Roman oppression.
So yesterday someone mentioned that some of these events, there was the cross involved in that, but you don't see the cross marked in Matthew 24 because they weren't expecting the cross, but they still haven't let go of this idea of a temporal kingdom here on earth. They still hold on to that doctrine at this late stage. So if Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, you have to have another capital, another city, another place where this kingdom has to, or the church has to keep on operating from. So this temporal kingdom that they're expecting Christ to set up, all these Old Testament passages that deal with the second coming, they're still factoring into that. So that's an important component that we need to add into it. Brother William?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that what the disciples, because Christ in chapter 23 has said that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. So to the disciples, they saw the judgment coming upon the Jews. So what they understood next is that because they are special people, if judgment is coming to them, then they are at the end of the world because of this judgment which is coming.
Who had the hand up? You had your hand up?
Yeah, I was about to say what you said.
What were you going to say?
Yeah. What I wanted just to say is what Brother said, that what these people were expecting the kingdom which was to be established in Israel and not a worldwide kingdom. So they were not looking for other people who are going to be involved in this kingdom to be set up.
So not only are they expecting a temporal kingdom, but the other thing that they've forgotten about is that there's a whole world to be saved, the Gentiles. It takes them a long while to start to work out that they need to go to the Gentiles. Even though they've been told to do that before this moment, they're still not going to go to the Gentiles for another 3.5 years. And in fact, when the time to go to the Gentiles happens, did they want to go and do that? Did they want to go and teach the Gentiles? They don't. They have to get forced to do that. Who forces them? Yeah, Saul forces them to start going to the Gentiles. Otherwise, without his help, they wouldn't have done that work. So just as an example, if we went to Acts 1:11, it's not connected to this directly, and it's after this event anyway, but God doesn't help them. He makes it difficult for them to understand these things. So it's some angels that come and said, ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus which is taken up from you into heaven shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven. So if an angel came to you and said, did you see Jesus just going up to heaven? Don't worry, he's going to come down again in the same manner. What would you think? Because you've just seen him go up into heaven. It says, as you have seen him go into heaven, what are you expecting? Sorry?
He's going to come back.
You know he's going to come back, but what else are you expecting if you saw him go up? Sorry? You're going to expect to see him coming down. What does that sound like to you? What generation are you?
That generation.
You're that generation. You're that final generation. You saw him go up. He said, don't worry. You're going to see him coming down again. So God kind of feeds into this idea. Ellen White doesn't help, does she? You know, Ellen White says, this generation, and they all start dying one after the other, and there's like a long while to go before anything happens. I don't know how many generations there have been since Ellen White's day. Maybe 6 or 7 generations. I don't mean the prophetic ones, but I mean literal generations. You know, if you get married when you're 20, 25, 100 years would be 4 generations. It's coming up to 200 years. So depending on where you pick it up from, 1798 is 220. So you've got at least 8, maybe it's 8 generations. It's a lot of generations, and they all talk like it's present truth. And don't we do that? We say, you know, Christ is coming at the end of the world. We've got all these prophecies to teach us that. Everyone does that, plays this game that it's all happening now. We're all the final generation. It's always the same story. The only person that fights that, to me, is Paul. He's the one who says Christ is not going to come back for a long time. Actually, he's not the only one. I guess if you went to, is it Jeremiah or Isaiah that's going to say you're going to stay in Jerusalem, don't panic, build houses, because that's about 3 generations just there that you're going to live in Babylon for. So there are a couple of stories where we know that you're going to have to wait, and that the end isn't going to happen in your lifetime. So we address that, and then because of their misunderstanding about the destruction of Jerusalem at the end of the world, they conflate or join these two things together. Jesus does the same. And then there's this important history between the two, and we spent some time addressing that because there was some confusion about what Jesus' mercy was. So hopefully we're all in agreement that the mercy that he's exhibiting is not that he's hiding any information here or there, but he's not giving them this information. And the question is why? My sister, why does he not give them information about the Dark Ages? Can't remember? No? Sister Joy?
I think it's because it will be very much discouraging for them.
Because it's very discouraging for them. Why is it discouraging?
Because they think that they're the last church, yet there is another church that is ahead, and it happens that it is the apostasy within that church that comes to persecute the Christians in the future.
Brother Robert?
They're discouraged because the 1260 would reveal to them that the church that they were building up with Christ would go into apostasy, and that apostasy will make the enemies of God's people to come and punish the church.
So if he had told them about this time period, there's a couple of things happening. First of all, millions of them are going to be killed, which would be disappointing. And the reason for that killing is punishment from Jesus because of their bad behavior, because they're apostasy. So as they begin to apostatize, God's going to turn around and punish them. And so that period is so bad, he just jumps over it and just gives a passing mention to that thing. Okay, so we've addressed all of that. I don't know if we've all had a chance to review that material. We had some discussion on the structure of Matthew 24. We haven't gone through Matthew 24 rigorously because I wasn't sure how familiar we were with that chapter. But I'm hoping now that we can see it's in 3 sections. They're in sequence, and Jesus is not jumping forward and backward, doing these repeating in large techniques that often happen. So as an example, verse 23 to 27 isn't in this history per se, it's actually all in sequence, so it's tucked into part of this 1260. Ellen White makes an application. She says it was fulfilled here, because she goes back to verse 11 where she marks false prophets, and it can also be applied in this history. But verse 27 specifically is a response that you would give when people say go to the desert place or go to the secret chambers. So the argument is that Christ isn't going to return back in that way. It's not marking literally his second advent here, which is verse 30. It's not marking that. So we have to be careful how we read the passage. Are there any questions on that?
So, yesterday we have talked about that all the things, and all the things, people have a different opinion, whereby we begin from 31 to the second coming of Christ. So,
I shouldn't have rubbed this out too quickly. Okay, so we're going to do all. Are you talking about all these things? What they are?
Yeah.
I'm going to do that in a minute. So I just want to make sure. I want to take this out first.
Okay. The structure that we have of Matthew 24 in this outline here, I don't understand how you're saying that Ellen White is going to make an application of 23-27 back to the history of that one AD. I don't understand that. Because when I read the quotation where you got that from, I don't see that. I see more that she's trying to compare that what happened in 11. So, okay, let me just get the quotation towards.
Okay, so before you, if you could multitask, we're in Matthew 24, and we're reading. By the time you get to verse 20, that's AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem. You agree with that? Yeah. Then 21 says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world, to this time, no, nor shall ever be." Now, when we read 21, or when you read 21, what do you see 21 to be? You're saying that's the 1260. So the way Jesus merges 20 and 21, you could read that if 20 is the destruction of Jerusalem, this is the great tribulation that's going to come upon God's people. Because Jerusalem's going to be utterly destroyed. There's going to be bloodshed upon God's people like there's never been before. So that would be a great tribulation. But when you get to verse 22, then it says, except those days should be shortened. Now we begin to question, how long is this period of tribulation going to be? So again, there's no indication here that it's the 1260. We're going in and actually doing that. Because if you didn't know anything and you just read that passage, you wouldn't know that it's 1260 years, would you? You have to go to other places to know that. So that tribulation could be a couple of weeks. We don't know how long it could be. So all of this can be squashed to just be one singular event. The destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the world. But now we're going to tuck in that it's the 1260. And we'd have to factor in Mark and Luke. Then you have to go to other places to fill out that history. So once we know that it's the 1260, we're into verses 21, then 22, except those days should be shortened, no flesh shall be saved. Then you get to verse 23. It says, then. So 23 to 28 is this new section. You agree with that? Okay, so if you were going to read, where would you put 23 to 27 when it begins with then?
Okay. If you look at the verses, just like they've identified. If you are faithful to the verses, you cannot identify the 1260 in those verses. So if you look at the structure of the verses, 23 to 28 has to be again that is the destruction of Jerusalem.
Not the Dark Ages? Because the tribulation's already begun in verse 21 and 22.
I'm saying if you read from the verses, how do you see the Dark Ages?
Okay, so if you're going to see that, there is no Dark Ages. It's just a singular event, which is all just one event. When Jerusalem gets destroyed, there's going to be a tribulation. Don't know how long it's going to be. The tribulation is going to be cut short. If it hadn't been cut short, all of the people would be killed, all of the church. So he cuts it short, and then you'll see a sign that says Jesus is about to return, and then he returns, and that's the end of the story. All a singular event. So that's how you would read the passage. Is that what you mean by being true to the verses?
Yeah, if you look at the verses.
Okay, so we've been true to the verses. It's all a singular event. Now we're going to go back into those verses, and we're still going to hopefully be true to the verses, but now we have a bit more information. We know that the destruction of Jerusalem is here. Then we're going to define what the tribulation is, because it's not defined what that tribulation is. We don't know the length of those days. So we're going to go in, take some other Bible passages, and we're going to say those days are 1,260 years. And we're going to define when that begins and ends. So we're still being true to the verses. Then verse 29 says, after those days, then you're going to get the signs of the second coming. So I think we're still being true to the verses.
Okay, I think my point was, if you read that from the Bible, I agree with that structure of putting the 327 there. But yesterday the idea was that it was a quotation in Ellen White, and that quotation was being used to promote that idea, but I don't see that from that quotation. But I can see that from the verses. 6:31.
Say that again, you lost me.
I'm saying the way we have walked with you through the verses, if you just, like you said, if you look at verse 21, based on verse 20, you conclude that that's the destruction of Jerusalem. Like if you look at the verses, you really don't have, like if you come here and ask what is the tribulation from the verses, you have no idea or anything that will tell you that this tribulation is the 1260. So you'll have to connect it with the destruction that is happening in the verse before.
Yeah, so I'm happy with all of that. So just developing that thought, if you went to Luke, I think it's in Luke. Actually 24:19 would do the same really. We'll go to we'll stick in Matthew 24:19. It says the same thing. Woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. So it mentions those days, and then if you go to 22, what does it say there? Those days
shall be shortened.
So those days in 22. If you were going to proof text that would have to be the same days as those days in 19. And we don't normally do that. We're going to place 19. We're going to place 19 here in 70, and we're going to place 22 over here, hundreds of years, 500 years into the future. But the passage deliberately isn't going to teach you that, because Christ has deliberately merged it all into a singular event. So we know what he's done. So are we going to unpackage it first before we start placing 23 to 27, or are we going to keep it in this merged form?
Okay, you keep it in the merged form, then you begin unpacking it.
Okay, so it's in the merged form, so now we're going to unpackage it. So when you unpackage it, are you still reading all of these verses faithfully, you're still being true to all the verses. Once you unpackage.
Yeah.
We're still doing that because all we're saying now is verse 19, those days is 66 to 70, and then 22, those days are not 66 to 70, those days are the 1260. So you can't proof text those two verses. Do we all agree with that? Okay, so if we're going to do that and then we get to verse 23, then it says, then, so we'll go back to how Ellen White's going to deal with this. Then if any man shall say unto you, how do we deal with the then?
That is happening at the same time.
So it's
repeat and enlarge.
So it's happening at the same time, a repeat and enlarge, or an enlargement of what's happening in that time period, some extra detail, or it could mean afterwards. This happened, then this happened. So if it said at the same time, when would the then be? Would it be connected to verse 19 or to verse 21 and 22?
Verse 21 and 22.
Which would be in the Dark Ages then. Okay, so it'd be in the Dark Ages. If you're going to merge it all, it would just be all at the same time. All of this is going to happen in the 70 period, or all of it's going to happen 2000 and whatever year it is. It's all going to, whichever way you're going to have thousands of years in the future, it's all going to happen in 70. If you're going to merge them all together. But if you don't merge them, you have these three distinct periods, we'd have to put 23 to 27 here with that word then. So is that being true to the verses?
Yeah.
Okay, so then your point was what?
My point was, from that thought and idea was not yesterday developed from the verses. It was developed from a quotation. But when I read that quotation, I couldn't see how it gives license of taking verse 23 to 27 back to the history of the destruction of Jerusalem.
You don't see how Ellen White's doing that?
I couldn't see it unless...
Okay, so let's read the quotation. Okay, so before we read, I don't mind people disagreeing with me. Are you disagreeing with what I said, or are you saying you don't understand what Ellen White's doing?
Okay, I'm disagreeing
with
to what you said based on this quotation. I don't know if it was you said it, but I'm agreeing on what you've explained because I couldn't explain it that way from the verses, but from this quotation I don't see that I could explain it that way. I don't see this quotation allowing me to pull back verse 23 to 27 back into the history of the destruction of Jerusalem, but I can see the verses can allow me to do that.
Okay, so what are you saying that I'm doing wrong?
I'm saying misreading of this quotation.
I've misread the quotation?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so we'll read the quotation. So the quotation put to one side. So I've tried to walk us through the verses. Do you agree with that explanation?
I agree with that.
Okay, so that was my primary argument yesterday, is that the verses are all in sequence, with one caveat, that when you go from, say, 5 to 20, I'm not saying every single one of those verses happens one after another. And I tried to show it this way. Some of those verses are happening at the same time. You know, they're getting persecuted at the same time. There are false prophets coming at the same time. All of those things are all happening together. So if we're okay with that, I'm saying it's in three distinct sections. Did we say this was 5 to 20? And we said this was 21 to 28. And this was 29 to 31. Is that what we've agreed on? So if we've agreed on that, I'm saying 23 to 28, its application is in here in the Dark Ages. Now, let's see what Ellen White says. So this is GC?
Oh. 631 paragraph 1. 631 paragraph 1.
Okay, so I'm going to drop back a couple of paragraphs. We'll go to 630.4. 630.4. It begins, pray ye that your flight not be in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So, what is that? Where's that coming from?
Verse 20.
Pray ye that your flight not be in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So she's quoting from verse 20. Christ said, he who made the Sabbath did not abolish it, nailing it to the cross. The Sabbath was not rendered null and void by his death. 40 years after his crucifixion, it was still to be held sacred. For 40 years, the disciples were to pray that their flight might not be on the Sabbath day. So she marks 40 years. But it's not really 40 years, is it?
It's Matthew 20, verse 20 and 70.
Yeah, that's what I mean. If you're going to do 40, it takes you to 70. But they're going to fly when? In 66. It's 3.5 years later. So we're okay with that, understanding that. From the destruction of Jerusalem, Christ passed on rapidly to the greater event, the last link in the chain of this earth's history, the coming of the Son of God in majesty and glory. Between these two events, there lay open to Christ's view long centuries of darkness, centuries for his church marked with blood and tears and agony. So, if we were going to read faithfully, like we said, we would know that the tribulation was centuries, not days.
Centuries of darkness.
So, if we weren't going to read faithfully, we'd think we'd read like the disciples are reading, it would be a few days and we'd have to merge all this. But a faithful reading of the passage would require us to break it down, because that's the truth, and we should be able to read that truth in the words themselves. So we know that the tribulation is hundreds of years. So can we read that into the passage? Yes, I think if you factor that in, it wouldn't be doing any violence to that passage. All that's happening is people have got preconceived ideas of how to approach the words, and they're going to proof text incorrectly. So I'm labelling this point about proof texting because in verse 21, 24-21, this is a side point. When it spoke about the Great Tribulation, it says this tribulation is going to be worse than any tribulation that's ever been on planet Earth. And you could tie that back into Daniel 12:1. You could tie that back into Daniel 12:1 if you were going to proof text it, and you'd come to the wrong answer. So I want to labour that point that proof texting is not that safe a method to use. It's easy to make mistakes if you proof text. So we agree with that, yeah? Because if you proof text these two verses that we just read, was it 19 and 22? 19 and 20. If you proof text that, you're going to make this one event, aren't you? And if you make it one event, you're going to come to the wrong answer. So you can't proof text those verses like that. All Ellen White's doing it, she's just confirming what we should already know. Upon these scenes, his disciples could not then endure to look, and Jesus passed them by with a brief mention. Then shall be great tribulation, he said, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time. No, nor ever shall be, and except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, the days shall be shortened. For more than 1,000 years, such persecution as the world had ever known, as the world had never before known, was to come upon Christ's followers. Millions of his faithful witnesses were to be killed. Had not God's hand been stretched to preserve his people, all would have perished. But for the elect's sake, he said, those days shall be shortened. Before we come on to this past the next one that we want to get to, it says, unless his hand had been stretched out to preserve his people. Who stretched his hand out to destroy his people? God. So there's always these two sides. God's the one that's destroying them, and at the same time he's the one that's preserving them from the destruction. So we always want to think about, especially the 1260, there's these two things that are going on, and depending on what point you want to make, you can either show that God is killing all of his people, or you can show God is preserving his people.
I want to ask, who are these elect?
But for the elect's sake, he said, those days shall be shortened. Who the elect? My brother, who are the elect?
The elect are the Church of God.
The Church of God.
That time period.
In that time period. My sister, who do you think the elect are?
Those who have the remnant.
The remnant? The remnant of whom?
God.
Remnant means leftover. Did the leftover of which group of people?
Those who have undergone the tribulations.
Sorry?
Those who have gone through persecutions. Those who have believed.
So, you said that the elect are the remnant. Tell me where you would put them on this line. In the 1260. So if they're in the 1260, they're the leftover of which group of people?
I can say, from the verse we read in chapter 3, verse 1.
1 second, can you repeat that?
Revelation 3, verse 1 showed that there was a Protestants who removed from the path of persecution.
Okay, so if you go to Revelation 3:1, if I did 1, 2, 3, where would you, which dispensation would Revelation 3:1 go in? Would it be in number 1, number 2, or number 3?
Number 2.
So, Sardis, where would you begin that history? Because that's Revelation 3:1. When we looked at it yesterday, we didn't focus on it because I didn't labour the point that Sardis can have different meanings, and one of the meanings is red, which means that they're alive. But another meaning is, I think someone said, those that remain, which sounds like a remnant, the people that are left over. It can also mean those that come out. So it has all these connotations. So we would normally place Revelation 3:1, Sardis, at 1798. So it would be here in this dispensation. This would be Sardis, which would be the remnant. So often people take this word elect and they think the elect is a singular word, and they want to proof text it all the way through different dispensations, trying to make it mean the same thing. And when you do that, if you come back to this passage, you can begin to get tripped up. Because what you did was, you said the elect is the remnant. And the remnant, we normally would go to Revelation 12, verse 17. It says the remnant of the seed of the woman, the bit that's left over. The bit that's left over is after all of this killing, all of this punishment, what's left over? And what's left over is the Millerites, basically, or we could say the Protestant churches here. That's all that's left over. And we could make an argument that they're the elect, but that's not the same elect that's being brought to view here. Does that make sense? Or is that too fast? Was that too fast? Yeah? So let me try and explain it in a different way then. Had God's hand not been stretched out to preserve his people, all would have perished. But for the elect's sake, he said, those days shall be shortened. So all I'm saying is that the elect that's been spoken of there is in number 2, not in number 3. And if we're going to go to Sardis, Sardis is what's left over after the 1260, and Sardis begins in this history, which is in dispensation number 3. So this elect couldn't be Sardis. That's what I'm suggesting.
Let's look at verse 31 and also elect 24:31.
And he shall send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So tell me which history we're in verse 31. 1, 2 or 3?
3.
We're in 3.
Yeah.
So we're in 3 there. And which one are we in? Oh, when it says, but for the elect's sake, which verse is that, by the way? We didn't go, which verse is that?
22.
And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake. So is the elect in 22 the same elect in verse 31?
That's the question.
Yeah, that's my question to you. Tell me where 22 is. 1, 2 or 3?
2.
So you've got an elect here, 22, and you've got an elect here, 31. So they can't be the same elect.
There's also another one in verse 31.
This in verse 24 you see.
Sorry?
Verse 24.
Well, let's just do 22 and 31 first. Do you agree that there can't be the same elect? Okay. So again, it's another problem about proof texting. If we went to 24, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. So we'll hold on to 24 for a moment, because 24 is in this problem, is one of the problem verses. So we'll leave verse 24 at the moment. So my brother asked who the elect are. Brother Rogers?
The elect that
we read 630.5, but for the elect's sake, he said, those days shall be shortened. And he said, who are the elect? So who are the elect?
Of 622.
Of the Desire of Ages 630.5.
Okay, the elect.
And she's quoting verse 22. Sorry? Thyatira. So this is God's people in this dispensation here.
So the elect are simply God's people.
Sorry?
Elect are God's people in that generation.
So the elect are God's people, yes. I think that's how I would understand it. Did that answer your question? Yeah? To your satisfaction? So I'm just saying, to me, it's just God's people in whatever dispensation they are. So the elect are in this one and the elect are in this one. You okay with that?
And we also say the elect were also with the destruction of Jerusalem.
Do you have a verse for that? Do you have a verse?
So because of tribulation, because you say
yes.
The tribulation can also be applied to the destruction of Jerusalem.
No, I'm not saying it can be. I'm saying the way Christ writes it, because of the disciples' preconceived ideas, their bad education, he makes it sound that way. I don't think that's what I would be cautious to say that the tribulation, verse 21, the tribulation in verse 21, I don't think that's AD 70. It sounds like it is, but I don't think it is. So I wouldn't put the tribulation back into AD 70, therefore the elect would be in the disciples' history. You could infer that there was an elect in each generation. I agree with that, but I wouldn't be putting 21 and pulling it back to AD 70. Obviously, this diagram's a bit deceptive because you've got 500 years here, 400 years of blank space. Okay, so let's read the next paragraph. This is the one. Now, in unmistakable language, our Lord speaks of his second coming, and he gives warning of dangers to precede his advent to the world. If any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So, she says, at the beginning of the passage, he speaks about his second coming in unmistakable language. He gives warnings of the dangers that precede his advent, and then he explains what his advent's going to look like. It's not the desert or the secret chamber, it's lightning. So it's not desert, it's not secret chamber, it's lightning, and he's speaking about his second advent and about the warning, so about the dangers that are going to happen before that. So the dangers before his second coming is that people are going to say his coming looks different to what it really is. Is that a fair approximation of this first half of the paragraph? There's the dangers before his second coming, and the danger is that people are going to give a wrong description of what the second coming looks like. They're going to say it looks like something secret, but it's going to be something visible. That's the danger. As one of the signs of Jerusalem's destruction, Christ had said, many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many. Many false prophets did arise. She's quoting, is that verse 11? That
is what happened to us.
She's quoting verse 11, yeah? Many false prophets shall arise.
But that's the portion we used to say that is making an application back to that history.
Okay, I'm not saying that I said something right. I'm going to work through it.
She's quoting verse 11.
So I'm just checking she's quoting verse 11. False prophets did rise, deceiving the people and leading great numbers into the desert. Magicians and sorcerers, claiming miraculous power, drew the people after them into the mountain solitudes. But this prophecy was spoken also for the last days. So, we'll stop there then. I'll go back. As one of the signs of Jerusalem's destruction, Christ had said, verse 11, one of the signs that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed is that there's going to be false prophets. The false prophets came, they did their work, and then she says, but this prophecy was spoken also for the last days. What is this prophecy?
This prophecy, according to me, is verse 11.
So does everybody agree that when she says this prophecy, she's only talking about verse 11 and not talking about verse 23, verse 23 and verse 24? Everybody agree with that? Do you agree with that? Yeah? I'm assuming the silence means we're all in agreement. Okay, so it does?
Can mean confusion.
Okay, so it could mean confusion. So you've got to speak to me Because otherwise I'm just going to go around the class and then I'm going to find out who's confused. Who doesn't understand what we're talking about or what's going on? Okay, so there are a couple of people. My brother? You understand or?
Yes, I understand.
You agree?
Yes, I understand.
Okay. So, what we're trying to understand from this paragraph is how Ellen White's using verses 23 and 24 and where they go. So, we've read that first part, and then she says in the second part, as one of the signs of Jerusalem's destruction, so she's gone back to number 1, Jerusalem's destruction, she's going to quote verse 11. There's going to be false prophets that are going to come before the destruction. And then she says, that really happened. Then she says, but this prophecy was spoken also for the last days. So my question was, when she says this prophecy, does she mean just verse 11 or verse 11 and 23 and 24? Is it everything that's in the paragraph or just that one verse? So that's my question. And so no one's disagreeing. Everyone, let me rephrase that. Everyone is agreeing that it's verse 11, this prophecy. Yeah? Someone said?
I'm saying she's specific.
She's specific. Okay, so we all agree, I agree, that this prophecy, verse 11, is also for the last days. But where was it meant to be? So verse 11 is here, but you can also apply it here. Agree with that?
So, to me, I was seeing she's more of making an application of verse 11 to the history of the end of the world than making an application of verse 23 back to the resurrection of Jerusalem.
Okay, so we'll read on. This sign is given as a sign of the second advent. Even now, false Christs and false prophets are showing signs and wonders to seduce his people.
It's about the disciples.
Sorry, his disciples. Even now, false Christ. Do we not hear the cry, behold, he is in the desert? So, what's that? What verse is that?
Verse 26.
So, that's 26. It says, even now, false Christs and false prophets are showing signs and wonders to seduce his disciples. So it says false Christ. Which verse is false Christ?
24.
And then she says even now. So even now is here in number 3. So she says now or even. What does the even mean? If I said even now.
Like happens sometimes.
I don't understand what
Even now, something that is happening. She's making a connection.
Sorry?
She's making a connection. Even now, she's making a connection with whatever is happening in that history is referring to have been happening in another history. Because if we read that line, says that, but this prophecy, so she's speaking of the history of the disciples, as she says, but this prophecy was spoken also for the last days.
Okay, so that's verse 11.
Yes, then she's going to connect it. This sign is given as a sign of the second advent. Even now, false Christ and false prophets are showing signs and wonders of seduction.
So tell me what even now means.
So I'm saying that the even now is kind of bringing in a connection that is given between the history of the end of the world and the
And how are you seeing even now?
The way I understand the even now is that this thing had already happened in verse 11 in history, and in the same fashion it is happening now.
But she already said that in 2 sentences before. But this prophecy was spoken also for the last days. She's already said that. So is she repeating herself when she says even now?
Even now, she's making now a connection between what happened in the 1260 and what will happen at the end of the world. Because now, when she says even now, false Christ, she's now quoting the history of what was happening during the 1260.
Sister Emma?
I'm not sure. I think she's just saying that even now we can see this around us happening in her time. Just relating.
We'll say our time, just at the end of the world, number 3. My brother?
She's saying these signs are going to happen before Christ is advent. But even now, as she writes, they are happening now.
When you say you added the word but, why did you add the word but?
She's addressing these signs to happen just before the second advent. But again, she says they have begun happening now.
But the now is before the second advent.
So it really means that even the second advent is just because these things have begun happening now.
Okay. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, can I say that Ellen White is giving repeat and enlarge, is expounding, because he stated first and then he repeats the same statement to enlarge for us to understand in our history, something that happened at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, and it will be repeated in our time. So there is a repetition there.
Okay.
I see it is. I want to agree with Brother Oyugi. He says it is kind of emphasis that is providing. She's expounding on verse 26. She's not explaining anything about verse 11. She's expounding on verse 26 that he is in the desert. Now he is saying even now, just the same way as it is used in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 18, when he said even now are there many antichrists. That is not a repetition. It is emphasis that is providing that what was said is going on rightly. That makes sense.
You said it's not what?
It's not a repetition.
It's not a repetition.
It's not a repetition. It's kind of an emphasis to point out that it is going on rightly.
Okay. Yeah, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Even now means that she was prophesying of what is going to happen before Christ comes, immediately before Christ comes. But when she said even now, I mean during her time, when she's still alive, that prophecy is already being fulfilled. False prophets and false Christ were already there even now, as she was writing that.
Okay.
Even now, to me, I think she was making connection of what has already taken place and what was going to take place at the end of the world. And we know, Paul says, the second advent will not be preached until the man of sin is revealed. So Sister White is writing this after 1798. So that means that thing had already happened and it is now repeating itself.
So if I had said something in the past, something was going to happen, which was a prediction, and I said, look, it's even happening right now. I think that's what she's saying, and I think a number of people have said that even now means it's actually being fulfilled before our very eyes, which is the evidence that we're here at the end of the world. So she said whatever was predicted is actually happening today. When she says false Christ and false prophets, which verse is she quoting there, Brother Rogers? Which verse is she quoting when she says, even now false Christ and false prophets? For there shall arise false Christ and false prophets. So she says, even now, verse 24 is happening. I'm going to take the even out and I'm going to say now verse 24 is happening. You okay with that? But just before that, she says this prophecy was also spoken for the last days. So verse 11 is just prophet, and verse 24 is Christ and prophets. Yeah? And then she says this is the evidence for it. Do we not hear today, people are already telling us, behold, he is in the desert. That's 26. So now you've got 24 and 26. Have not thousands gone into the desert hoping to find Christ? And from thousands of gatherings where men profess to hold communion with departed spirits, is not the call now heard? Behold, he is in the secret chambers. What's that? Secret chambers. The verse. That's still verse 26. This is the very claim that Spiritism puts forth. But what says Christ? Don't believe it. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even to the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Which is verse 27. That's verse 27. So verse 27 is just basically the argument that we should be giving to those people who are doing verse 26. So if someone practices verse 26, they're going to a desert, we should tell them that's wrong, don't do that. You should believe verse 27, even though it hasn't happened yet. So let's just summarize then. She says verse 11 was here, prophets, and verse 11 is going to be fulfilled again. And then, not literally in the next sentence, but I think 2 sentences on, then she says, today, verse 24 is being fulfilled. And when she says even now, it means everything that has been prophesied that was going to happen, even now is actually happening. Is that how you would read that, even now? But this prophecy was spoken also for the last days. This sign is given as a sign of the second advent. Even now, false Christs and false prophets are showing signs and wonders. Could we say, even now, the prophecy is being fulfilled? So, if I were to say, even now, the prophecy is being fulfilled, what prophecy is being fulfilled? Because she's quoting verse 24, Christ and false prophets, but the one that she's just mentioned when she said this prophecy was verse 11. So how do you read that? I just want to give him a second because he had that question. Okay, I'll give you a moment.
How I see it is that she's naturally showing us that the two, verse 11 and verse 24, she's using them interchangeably. So I would understand it to mean that she's saying verse 11 is also verse 24.
Okay, do you understand it? She's going to quote verse 11. But she's going to say this prophecy of verse 11 was also spoken for the last days.
Okay.
So this prophecy is verse 11. Spoken for is verse 23 downwards. Though it was spoken for the last days, we'll get it in verse 24 downwards.
Okay, so verse 11, when it gets brought into this history, you're saying verse 11, what it looks like here, is verse 23 and verse 24.
Downwards.
Sorry? Yeah, obviously downwards. Which is, I think, what my brother's saying. She's ending up merging 11 and 24. If 24 is the Christ and the false prophets, obviously 23 mentions the Christ as well. 11 and 24, she ends up merging them together when she says, this prophecy, verse 11, was spoken for our day, dispensation number 3. And look, it's being fulfilled. And when it's being fulfilled, it's not just the prophets, it's the false Christ as well. So she's... I think you're saying the same thing when the brother at back says she just uses them interchangeably or merges them, that verse 11 in its present day fulfillment becomes verse 24. Is that how you... So if you do that, we've got the false Christ and the false prophets. So when did you have false Christ? Only here at the end of the world. Because we know we have false Christ here in the history, but there's no verse that does that. So I don't think there's any verse. Is there?
Yeah, there is a verse.
Oh, there is a verse.
Yeah. That's fine.
For many shall come in my name saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Okay, there it is, yeah. So she doesn't mention verse 5 anywhere, but verse 5 is here. So this is where we're going to start doing things that Ellen White isn't going to do. If we said verse 11 can go here, I think we're going to be happy to say we could put verse 5 here as well. You'd be happy to do that. So if we did that, then you've got much more license to say that verse 24 is verse 5 and verse 11, because you've got the Christ and the prophets. Are we okay with that? Sister Emma?
She also links it by quoting verse 24 in reference to verse 11 in the beginning of the passage. She just says...
Wait, which passage? This is 631 paragraph 1?
Yes. So when she quotes
Now?
in the middle of it, as one of the signs of Jerusalem's destruction, Christ had said, many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. She goes on to say, false prophets did rise, deceiving the people, bringing great numbers into the desert. So she mentions desert there, which we only see in 24. And then she goes on to say, magicians and sorcerers claiming miraculous power drew the people after them into their mountain solitudes. I think you can make the case that mountain solitudes are lonely. His secret chambers is a secret. But you could definitely see deserts. You would go in mountain solitudes and secret chambers. So she's deserts in there, but it doesn't say deserts in the verse.
Yeah, but she's not quoting a verse when she says that. She's just telling you the literal history.
Yeah.
In the literal history, they went into a desert area.
Which is how it's described in 24. It's not described as a desert area in 11. It's described as a desert area in 24. So she's kind of, herself is intermingling the two descriptions.
So verse 11, many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many. That's verse 11. Is that right? And what they did was they led people into the desert. That's a historical fact. And then you're going to have that same scenario being fulfilled here at the end of the world. Okay, so coming back to your original question, what did I do wrong yesterday? Is it been corrected, whatever I did wrong? Or not yet? Okay, because I'm still not sure what I did wrong, but as long as
No, this quotation was read, and it was said that Christ was making a prediction of verse 23 to 27 to the history of the destruction of Jerusalem. Not Christ.
Ellen White. And what is she actually doing?
To me, the way I'm seeing it is that she's making an application of verse 5 and verse 11 to the history of the end of the world.
Okay, so she's making verse 11 and applying it to the end of the world. And what's she doing with 24?
Verse
23 and 24, what's she doing with those verses?
She's showing how they are being fulfilled. Now it's the application of verse 11 is being fulfilled in those verses, verse 23 and 24 are being fulfilled in that history.
Okay. Okay, so as long as we're all happy that we saw that whatever I said wrong yesterday's been sorted out, my brother?
So I now still don't understand how we pull
Back to here. Because if you can get these ones and bring them up to here, why can't you get these ones and bring them back to here?
What's the problem of having those ones there?
What was the?
When 327, what's the problem of having them there?
Here.
No.
Here.
Yes.
What's the problem with having them there?
They're problems.
No, I don't think Brother Roger's saying there's a problem. I think he was saying that I wasn't reading the passage properly, which probably is so. I probably wasn't reading it properly.
This is what I'm saying. In 327, they were getting them at 1798.
I'm saying when I read those verses, I'm not locating them there. I'm locating them in the 1260. If I was going to read the verses as they're given to us. As they're given to us, I'm saying they belong here, just in this structure which everybody sort of says they agree. And I think what I was trying to say yesterday is Ellen White is taking verses 23 to 27 out of this history and bringing it here to the end of the world. And if you're going to bring it here to the end of the world, then you had the license to take it back to this history. That's what I was trying to say yesterday. I'm saying the original context is in this history. And if that's the original one, then maybe application isn't the right way of saying it, but I think she's made an application here, and if you can do that there, then you make an application back. But I'm not saying she's making an application back to this history. She's making an application into this history, and I'm arguing that it is an application because it originally should belong in the Dark Ages. And so by inference, you can apply it there. So if I said that the statement itself applied, or she was applying it to this history, she wasn't. She was applying it to this history. But I'm saying this isn't where it's actually, the verses are actually given. Brother, you okay?
Yeah, I think the most important thing we should look at the structure of this chapter. It has events and then the warnings that should prevent in order not to be deceived. That's why you see Henry will quote verse 11 and brings it to the event at the end of the days. Yeah. So the structure is we have the three events in the whole chapter. Then he gives us warnings. The warnings are like there shall be many false prophets and false Christs, which can either be in the before the destruction of Jerusalem or during the 1260 days. You can also apply it in what? At the end of the world.
Yep. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, so like I want to ask a question. Like applying verse 24, it's back to the history of destruction of Jerusalem. So Sister Emma has that when we read the quote here, Ellen White connect desert and mountain, and then we see that they are connected with verse 24. So to that one, give us a license to apply verse 24 and connect them with verse 5 and verse 11.
I'm happy to do that. I agree with that. I think if I understand what Brother Rogers is saying, because I didn't fully understand what he was arguing before, is that the quote itself, the point that she's making is not that she wants to make an application here. The point is she wants to make an application there. Is that what you were saying? And I agree with that. But what I ended up saying is if you can do that, then you can make an application here. So depending on how you want to read into that, how far you want to read, because I think you're inferring that even in the passage you can infer that she's talking about you can make an application there, but that's not her point. And I think what he's doing correctly is saying if we want to do what I'm saying we all should be doing, is reading the inspiration for what it is, and don't read into stuff. If you're going to read into it, you should tell people, now I'm reading into what she's saying. So I want to say, I'm going to read into what she's saying, and you can do this if you read into it. But that's not what she is saying. She's saying, I want to take verse 11 and bring it here, And then I'm going to overlay verse 24 here. That's all she says. She doesn't tell you where verse 23 to 27 go. She seems to infer that it goes here at the end of the world. That's the inference that she gives, the way she sort of lays that out at the beginning of the paragraph. She says, now in unmistakable language, the Lord speaks of his second coming. And then she says 23 to 27 basically. And I'm saying 23 to 27 goes in this history here, not in this one. So that's what I'm saying it is. She just mentions 23 to 27, brings it into this history, and I'm saying that is an application. It's not in its original setting. She doesn't say that. And then she says, I'm going to bring 11 into this history. And so all of this is happening here. And the reason we had this discussion is because people wanted to, someone said, 27 actually goes here. Historically, I'm saying 27 doesn't go there historically. 27 is in this history. To bring it out into here, you have to be making an application of it. And I'm saying if you can make an application, which is why we read these verses here, you can then put it back into the history of the disciples. But she's not doing that explicitly. She's taking their history and bringing it to the end. Then I was saying, well, if you can do that, you can take it back the other way. So, last question or statement.
I just wanted to emphasize.
1 second, can you start again? I didn't hear.
I'm saying, I just want to read a quote to emphasize on that from paragraph 2.
Right there. Let me get there.
Paragraph
631, paragraph 2. 28. 38.
628, paragraph 2.
1 second. 628, paragraph 2. Turning to the disciples.
Exactly.
Can I read it for the camera? Then you tell me the point you want to make. Turning to the disciples, Christ said, "Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." What Bible verse is that? That's verse 5. Many false messiahs will appear, claiming to work miracles and declaring that the time of the deliverance of the Jewish nation has come. These will mislead many. Christ's words were fulfilled. Between his death and the siege of Jerusalem, many false messiahs appeared. But this warning was given also to those who live in this age of the world. The same deceptions practiced prior to the destruction of Jerusalem have been practiced through the ages and will be practiced again.
So my point was that these things, they literally happened in the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. But now Ellen White is going to reverse and tell us, emphasizing that they shall be repeated again prior to Christ's second coming.
So we just read verse 5?
Yeah.
So we put verse 5 and we brought it here. And I said, well, we just did that. This is the problem if you don't read systematically, because if we'd read systematically, we would have caught out, we would have picked up that verse 5 is being done actually before verse 11 is being done that way. We would have already seen that. But because we're sort of doing it ad hoc, we're not picking all the things up. So when I said, well, if you can do verse 11, you can do verse 5, and I said, well, that was my guess. Obviously it's not. She's actually doing that. So she's taking verse 5 and 11, the Christ and the prophets, and bringing them there, and that's how she's bringing 24 into that same history.
And that last sentence is good to support the fact that it's in the Dark Ages, because I think it's hard to see that 23 to 27 is in the Dark Ages, but she says, have been practiced through the ages and get practiced again. So you can see it carrying all the way through there.
The same deceptions practiced prior to the destruction of Jerusalem have been practiced through the ages and will be practiced again.
Yes.
In all three, yeah. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we give you praise and thanks. Help us, Lord, to give you honour through our behaviour and our action through this day. We thank you for the study of your word, how it can encourage us and correct us and train us to be the people that you want us to be. We ask for a special blessing upon the food that you've provided for our needs. And all these things we ask for in Jesus' name. Amen.